Hi everyone, and welcome to the Dynamic Accountability webinar. Dynamic Accountability, a people power approach to accountability. I'm Erica Veranda, project coordinator of Accountable Now, and I am with Isabel Buchner, program officer of Accountable Now. So in this webinar, we'll be learning a bit on how to build a common understanding of what is dynamic accountability and introduce you guys also what's the global standard as an initial step to this approach. We will be covering the following points. What is dynamic accountability? Why should we practice dynamic accountability? What does it actually look like? And how do I go about it? We'll have a bit more of a conversation with Isa here about what is dynamic accountability. So please join the conversation. If you have some ideas that come up when you're seeing this webinar, some feedback, please at hashtag accountability, dynamic accountability, or at CSO standard. So let's start, shall we? Isa, could you tell us? Could you tell us a bit more? What is dynamic accountability? What are we talking about when we're talking about dynamic accountability?
Yeah, so maybe let me start by saying there is no fully comprehensive and single simple definition that we have of the dynamic accountability yet. So as the term implies, the term is dynamic in itself and it adapts over time. So the context is crucial here, and we need to adapt the way we understand dynamic accountability based on it. But we have some key characteristics that can be used when explaining it. So for us, dynamic accountability is an inclusive, participatory, and bottom-up approach to practice accountability that goes beyond transparency and more static traditional forms of accountability that are more seen as checkbox exercises or sound financial management and auditing. It is driven by what we call meaningful stakeholder engagement through two-way feedback stream and closed feedback loops. So what that means is that you are not just asking your primary constituents for feedback, but that you also report back up to them what you actually changed based on their feedback. And also what's quite important is to let them know what can't be changed. So if there is any kind of feedback that you can't implement, let them know why, in order to build the trust with them that their feedback is heard, even if you're not necessarily able to implement it. Another point is that you need to engage a range of different stakeholders. So this means, of course, especially the people most affected by your work, but also donors, other stakeholders in the community, local partners. Dynamic accountability is quite a 360 approach to accountability, and you need to pay attention to all of the stakeholders you have in your project. Further, it requires a more agile and adaptive programming based on the needs of your stakeholders. So looking at what we said before, a range of stakeholders actively seeking feedback. You cannot do that in the more traditional way we have at the moment, where we have the backlog frame and we need to abide to it. You need to be adaptive, you need to be agile in order to actually practice dynamic accountability. And another thing that is kind of implied when we talk about meaningful stakeholder engagement, and also when we think about how dynamic accountability is different from other forms of downward accountability we know, there is a need for CSOs to loosen hold of their power. So if you practice accountability to your stakeholders and you go into communities and approach them with set questions around what you want to know from them. You're not necessarily practicing dynamic accountability because you're asking the questions you want to be answered and not necessarily the questions your stakeholders want to be answered. And this is, of course, not something you do once at the beginning of your project and then it's done. It's a continuous conversation, and you need to improve based on your stakeholders' feedback and make this a continuous process throughout all of your project cycle.
That sounds very interesting, and it actually is gonna dynamic accountability seems like it's gonna transform the way we work as organizations inside and out, and how we engage with our stakeholders. We're moving away from these check the box. I consulted them, but instead engage with the dialogue with them, and actually bring them and into a bit of the driver's seat or the core of our decisions. So why should I change, for example, the way I practice accountability, thinking most of us have already accountability mechanisms within our organizations? Why should I practice accountability if I already have some such mechanisms in place?
Yeah, that's a good question, of course. When we think about the way we practice accountability traditionally, it's rather static and constraining to the voice of your stakeholders. So if you, for example, at the end of the year, write an accountability report and put it on your website, it's not necessarily the best way to be transparent to your stakeholders. It's not necessarily the place they would look for the information, and in that sense, you would miss out on what they have to say about your work. So dynamic accountability challenges these ways we have traditionally done accountability by really putting the question on what do your stakeholders think in the center of our work. And it provides the foundation for responsiveness and becoming more effective organizations that earn the trust of our stakeholders in order to prove our legitimacy, and in that way ultimately also increasing our resilience.
It's an interesting, and it's how dynamic accountability can strengthen our own work and also help us become more resilient to what's happening out there in these times of shrinking civic space. And so this abstract concept of dynamic accountability sounds very promising, but then how does it actually look like? What are the actual steps, the process for dynamic accountability?
So So the next, the actual steps, as I was raising before, being transparent is always the first step you need to do. And here it is important that you are not just transparent for the sake of being transparent, which means putting your report on the website without your primary stakeholders not necessarily having internet access. So being transparent means you need to do it in a way that your stakeholders have easy access to the information. The information is packaged in a way so it's interesting for your stakeholders, and it's linked to a wider accountability mechanism. So also on the information you make transparent, you need to make sure that your stakeholders know how they can react to the information that you display. And that is ultimately linked to creating spaces and tools of listening and participation. So these spaces need to be linked to the information that is made transparent. And also these spaces also need to be accessible for your stakeholders, appropriate also, so that they not just theoretically can access them, but they actually have an interest in using the spaces, and it also needs to be practical for you, so you get the necessary information that you need for listening, and drive learnings from what you hear. So the next stage would be reflective learning and responsive decision making. So it's important for you to not just listen to your stakeholders, hear what they have to say, put it in an Excel file, and then never look at it again. You need to find a way so you really reflect what your stakeholders want to tell you, what they want you to do, and what is feasible for you to do, and how can you actually do it. So in that process, you need to consider what of the things your stakeholders tell you can actually be implemented in your decision making, and you need to process this in a way so the decision makers in your organization can make use of what the stakeholders have told you. And then once the decisions are made, once you implemented their feedback, or maybe haven't implemented some of the feedback, you need to close the feedback loop, which means going back to the ones who gave you the feedback, going back to the spaces and tools for listening, and report back on what feedback was implemented, how it was implemented, maybe if there is some feedback that will be implemented in the future, and feedback that is not implemented. And this step is quite important to make this a useful exercise, because without it, you're not necessarily getting the trust of your stakeholders that you're actually going to change something based on their feedback, but that they are reassured that what they do is useful. And in that sense, you also increase the participation in your spaces and tools for listening. Because usually if the participation rates are low from stakeholders to give you feedback, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have any feedback. It can also mean that they think their feedback won't change anything anyhow, so they are less willing to give you that feedback. So if you close the loop, if you show how useful their feedback was, this will also encourage others to give you more and more feedback in the future. And this is why the step is so important for our ultimate goal, to make our work more effective, make it increase the trust, and become more legitimate and resilient organizations.
That sounds like it's a continuous dialogue with them, and it will definitely transform the way we work. It requires us to be adaptive. It requires us to be agile, to change basically the way we work with us organizations, and that definitely also seems like it does represent some challenges on the road to achieving dynamic accountability. I'm thinking, for example, one that comes first to mind would be, we're opening spaces for feedback, and we're listening, and we're reflecting, but then do we really have the resources to adapt our work to their feedback? Are we generating some expectations we cannot achieve? Those are some of the questions that we have come up with, and of the challenges that can present dynamic accountability, and there's many more challenges that are presenting within dynamic accountability that we have to reflect as organizations of how can we overcome them. And with that, some ways in which we can see how dynamic accountability can look in how can we go about overcoming these challenges. One way could be the global standard. The global standard for CSO accountability, it's a standard made by 9 organizations through several consultative processes, where we can see how dynamic accountability looks in practice and how to go about it in different dimensions. And so, for example, we have these 12 commitments which focus on what we want to achieve, our approach to change, what do we do internally, and there are different ways to practice it. It comes from promoting a healthy planet to fostering responsible decision making, from advocating for justice, equality, empowering effective staff and volunteers. And it's mostly aimed to give us an idea of how could we strengthen our work, and it does not replace other standards, but it strengthens them. And since it was a co-creation process, it's meant to be able to be adapted to different contexts, different organizational capacities, and you can start with different commitments based on your current organizational capacity. So, for example, take commitment 8, open organizations. So with this commitment, we're aiming to be transparent about who we are, what we do, our successes and failures. And one of the most basic things most of us already do is publish our annual report on our website and showcasing mostly our successes and our finances. However, are we really sharing information that is relevant for our work, funding sources, the impacts we're having to our stakeholders? Are we providing this information in a friendly manner, as Isabel said? Is it relevant for them? So we have to ask these things, and if we want to ask ourselves, how could we strengthen and become more open and more transparent about our work? If we want to constantly engage with our stakeholders, foster their feedback, create realistic expectations, we have to think of what information we are sharing of our work and how are we sharing it. Do our key stakeholders find information useful, timely, and accessible? How and through which channels are we sharing information of our work, resources, failures, and successes? And for example, one of the way we can go about it is, for example, one of Accountable Now members, for example, works with children, might produce information and reports that are children friendly, and other organizations can create audio recordings and graphic visualizations of their policies and their work for people that are illiterate people. So the global standard can give you some pathways of how to go about becoming more accountable and adopting a dynamic accountability approach. And the global standard will allow us to reflect upon our standards, policies, and practices and move more to a more inclusive and dynamic engagement with our stakeholders. Every organization can engage with it and at its own pace. And we would invite you to challenge your practice by adopting dynamic accountability and using the global standard as one tool. We also have different materials on the website, and that can be very useful. The guided material include key actions, reflection questions, and with our next webinar on how to start with dynamic accountability, you're going to learn more on self-assessment tools and how to align as a possibility for align with the global standard. So we'll invite you to challenge the way you go about accountability and think about it in a broader sense and start engaging with your stakeholders and having and adopting a dynamic accountability approach. So thank you, and if you have any questions, please share it with us.